My name is Judith Ruderman, and I'm going to read to you today 2 essays from a book called Ex Libris, Confessions of a Common Reader. We're all common readers, and she is the daughter of Clifton Fadiman, whom you may remember as a kind of public intellectual from years ago, and a wonderful writer in her own right. A few of you here were present the last time I read, when I read 2 essays from this same book by her, and they were very entertaining, amusing, but yet thought-provoking. The first one was called Marrying Libraries, and it was about when Anne Fadiman married George Holt, and they had to marry their libraries and determine which books they could keep, especially if they had duplicate copies. Which women in love were they going to keep, and which were they going to toss? That was Marrying Libraries. The other one was called Never Do That to a Book. And it was all about the things that various people think other people do incorrectly to books, such as highlight, write in the margins, bend down the corners as bookmarks, put the book upside down and break the spine, and that elicited a little bit of a conversation about what you all feel you should never do to a book. So I have chosen 2 essays today, the second one of which may also elicit a little bit of conversation. So the reason I wrote the name of that second essay on here is because it's, when I would pronounce it, the his-er problem, I'd have to spell it. So the his-er problem is the name of that essay, but we'll do that second. The first essay is Secondhand Prose, no doubt a take on the famous Fanny Brice song. Secondhand Rose, they call me Secondhand Rose, and we all know secondhand clothes. Well, this is an essay about secondhand prose, and I'm going to start with that. Okay. On the morning of my 42nd birthday, George informed me that I was about to be spirited to a mystery destination. I followed him to the subway. We got off at Grand Central Station, where he commanded me to stand at a discreet distance during his sotto voce procurement of 2 round-trip tickets to somewhere. After a half-hour's ride through the Bronx and Yonkers, we disembarked at a town called Hastings-on-Hudson. What could possibly await us here? A 3-star restaurant? A world-class art collection? A hot air balloon stocked with a magnum of Veuve Clicquot and a pound of caviar, from which we would achieve a hawk's-eye view of the Hudson Valley? I trailed George along the sleepy main street and down a steep hill. "We're here," he said. Then I saw it. A weather-beaten little shop perched on such a declivitous slope that it looked in danger of sliding into the Hudson River, with a faded blue sign over the door that said, "Bookstore." Inside were an unkempt desk, a maze of out-of-plumb shelves, a flurry of dust motes, and 300,000 used books. Not 30, 300,000. 7 hours later, we emerged from the River Run bookshop carrying 19 pounds of books. I weighed them when we got home. Now you know why I married my husband. In my view, 19 pounds of old books are at least 19 times as delicious as 1 pound of fresh caviar. You may prefer Veuve Clicquot for your birthday, but give me, well, actually you can't because George beat you to it. Give me a $9 1929 edition of Vincent Starrett's Pennywise and Book Foolish, a tender paean to book collecting that contains the following sentence. Quote, "Every new search is a voyage to the Indies, a quest for buried treasure, a journey to the end of the rainbow, and whether or not at the end there shall be turned up a pot of gold or merely a delightful volume, there are always wonders along the way." Not everyone likes used books. The smears, smudges, underlinings, and ossified toast scintillae left by their previous owners may strike daintier readers as a little icky, like secondhand underwear. When I was young, I liked my books young as well. Virginal paperbacks, their margins a tabula rasa for narcissistic scribbles, were cheap enough to inspire minimal guilt when I wrote in them, and bland enough to accept my defacements without complaint. In those days, just as I believed that age would buffet other people's bodies but not my own, so I believed my paperbacks would last forever. I was wrong on both counts. My college penguins now explode in clouds of acidic dust when they are prized from their shelves. Pennywise and Book Foolish, on the other hand, remains ravishing at the age of 68, its binding still firm and its bottle green cover only slightly faded. After paperbacks lost their allure, I converted to secondhand books, partly because I couldn't afford new hardbacks, and partly because I developed a taste for bindings assembled with thread rather than glue, type set in hot metal rather than by computer, and frontispieces protected by little sheets of tissue paper. I also began to enjoy the sensation of being a small link in a long chain of book owners. The immaculate first editions cherished by rare book collectors, no notes, no signatures, no book plates, now leave me cold. I've come to view margins as a literary commons with grazing room for everyone. The more the merrier. In fact, the only old book I am liable to approach with unease is one with uncut pages. On an earlier birthday, George gave me a 2-volume set of Farthest North, Fridtjof Nansen's account of his unsuccessful attempt to reach the North Pole by ship. The edges were unopened. As I slit them with an unpracticed fingernail, I was overcome with melancholy. These beautiful volumes had been published in 1897, and not a single person had read them. I had the urge to lend them to as many friends as possible in order to make up for all the caresses they had missed during their first century. Alas, wrote Henry Ward Beecher, and I quote, "Where is human nature so weak as in the bookstore?" Mine is relatively strong at Barnes & Noble's, because I know that if I resist a volume on one visit and somebody else buys it, an identical volume will pop up in its place like a plastic duck in a shooting gallery. And if I resist that one, there will be another day, another duck. In a secondhand bookstore, each volume is one of a kind, neither replaceable from a publisher's warehouse nor visually identical to its original siblings, which have accreted individuality with every change of ownership. If I don't buy the book now, I may never have another chance. And therefore, like Beecher, who believed the temptations of drink were paltry compared with the temptations of books, I am weak. At least my frailty places me in good company. Southey, noted one observer, could not pass a bookstall without just running his eye over for 1 minute, even if the coach, which was to take him to see Coleridge at Hampstead, was within the time of starting. Of Macaulay, it was said there was no one quite so ready to mount a ladder and scour the top shelf for quarto pamphlets or curious literary relics of a bygone age and come down after an hour's examination covered with dust and cobwebs, sending for a bun to take the place of his usual luncheon. And when the 18th century London bookseller James Lackington was a young man, his wife sent him out on Christmas Eve with half a crown, all they had, to buy Christmas dinner. He passed an old bookshop and returned with Young's Night Thoughts in his pocket and no turkey under his arm. "I think I have acted wisely," he told his famished wife, "for had I bought dinner, we should have eaten it tomorrow, and the pleasure would have been soon over. But if we should live 50 years longer, we shall have the Night Thoughts to feast upon." When I visit a new bookstore, I demand cleanliness, computer monitors, and rigorous alphabetization. When I visit a secondhand bookstore, I prefer indifferent housekeeping, sleeping cats, and sufficient organizational chaos to fuel my fantasies of stumbling on, say, a copy of Poe's Tamerlane, like the one a fisherman found under a stack of agricultural tracts in a New Hampshire antiques barn in 1988 and purchased it for $15. It was auctioned at Sotheby's later that year for $198,000. I might note that people too well-bred to mention money in other contexts do not hesitate, if they think they have gotten a bargain, to quote the sum they have spent for a used book. Lamb wrote Coleridge, "I have lit upon Fairfax's Godfrey of Boulogne for half a crown. Rejoice with me." And he wrote to Southey, "I have picked up too another copy of Quarles for 9 pence. O tempora, o lectores." I came across Lamb's cries of jubilation in Volume 1 of the Life and Works of Charles Lamb, an undated 2-volume edition deluxe, complete with illustrations, which I purchased for $15. Rejoice with me. The only problem with lugging home 19 pounds of books from Hastings-on-Hudson was that several thousand pounds of books already overcrowded our shelves. Over the years, as our loft has come to look less and less like a home, and more like a secondhand bookstore, I have frequently fantasized about making the designation official. Wouldn't it be fun when the children are grown to become book dealers ourselves? Colt and Fadiman, old books bought and sold, dog-eared volumes our specialty. Alas, I fear the reality might be a rude awakening. In a 1936 essay titled Bookshop Memories, George Orwell recalled his days as a clerk in a secondhand bookstore. The hours were long, the shop was freezing, the shelves were strewn with dead bluebottle flies, and a large fraction of the customers were lunatics. Worst of all, the books themselves gradually lost their luster. "There was a time when I really did love books," he wrote. "Loved the sight and smell and feel of them. I mean, at least if they were 50 or more years old. Nothing pleased me quite so much as to buy a job lot of them for $1 at a country auction. But as soon as I went to work in the bookshop, I stopped buying books. Seen in the mass, 5 or 10,000 at a time, books were boring and even slightly sickening." Was this an inevitable response, akin to the ice cream disenchantment that reportedly overtakes every Baskin-Robbins employee? Or was it, as I hope, just Orwellian cynicism? I consulted my friend Adam, who had spent every Saturday of his sophomore and junior years at Harvard working in the Pangloss bookshop in Cambridge. He confessed that he had been similarly disillusioned, and I'm quoting from Adam. "I came to feel that a book without a home is a pointless thing, and in a bookshop, that's all you have. This hit me very powerfully when I visited the apartment of John Clive, the historian, after he died in 1990, to pack up his library and move it to our store. I had taken Clive's class on the British Empire that semester, but he was an unflashy lecturer, and I didn't feel I'd gotten to know him. It was only when I saw his bookshelves, James Bond paperbacks cheek by jowl with 19th century parliamentary proceedings, that I got a sense of who Clive really was. His intellectual furnishings explained him in a way his lectures hadn't. We took the books back to the store and divided them up by topic. History on the left wall, literature on the right wall, philosophy in the back alcove. And somehow, all of a sudden, they weren't John Clive anymore. Dispersing his library was like cremating a body and scattering it to the winds. I felt very sad, and I realized that books get their value from the way they coexist with the other books a person owns, and that when they lose their context, they lose their meaning. When I was leaving work that day, I noticed that the proprietor had put one of Clive's books in the 50-cent cart we kept on the sidewalk. It was an Edwardian compact Shakespeare with an ugly typeface and garishly colored plates. Inside, in a round adolescent hand that must have dated from his teens or early 20s, Clive had written his name and the lines from The Tempest. "We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep." I asked Adam what he had done with the book. "I bought it," he said, "and took it home." So that's secondhand prose. And now we're going to go to the his-er problem, which has relevance to today, even though this book collection is, I think, from 2003. As you will see, it has relevance for today. When I was 19, William Shawn interviewed me for a summer job at The New Yorker. To grasp the full import of what follows, you should know that I considered The New Yorker a cathedral, and Mr. Shawn a figure so godlike that I expected a faint nimbus to emanate from his ruddy head. During the course of our conversation, he asked me what other magazines I hoped to write for. Esquire, the Saturday Review, and I wanted to say Ms., but my lips had already butted against the M, too late for a politic retreat, when I realized I had no idea how to pronounce it. Lest you conclude that I had been raised in Ulaanbaatar, I might remind you that in 1973, when I met Mr. Shawn, Ms. magazine had been published for scarcely a year, and most people, including me, had never heard the word Ms. used as a term of address. Mr. Shawn had called me Miss Fadiman. He was so venerated by his writers that Mr. had virtually become part of his name. Its pronunciation reflexive now, Ms., was not as obvious as you might think. After all, Mr. was not pronounced mere, and Mrs. is not pronounced mers. Was it Ms., Ms., Muzz? In that apocalyptic split second, I somehow alighted on MS, which I knew to be the correct pronunciation of small m, small s, period, or manuscript. Mr. Shawn didn't blink. He gave no indication that I had said anything untoward. In fact, he calmly proceeded to discuss the new feminist magazine, its history, its merits, its demerits, the opportunities it might offer a young writer like me, for 4 or 5 minutes without ever mentioning its name. Since that time, whenever I have heard anyone talk about civility, I have thought of Mr. Shawn, a man so civil that in order to spare me embarrassment, he succeeded in crossing an entire minefield of potential muses without detonating a single one. I consider his feat comparable to that of Georges Perec, the experimental French writer, who composed a 311-page novel without using the letter E. After I left the building, I called a friend. How do you say that new word? Oh my God, no! That was a terrible moment, but as Mr. Shawn had surmised, wanting to die in a telephone booth was greatly preferable to wanting to die in his office. In 23 years, an eye blink in our linguistic history, the new little word has evolved from a cryptic buzz to an automatism. Oh, well. From the beginning, I saw its logic and fairness. Why should people instantly know if a woman, but not a man, was married? Why should they care? The need for ms was indisputable. The hitch was feeling comfortable saying it. It sounded too much like a lawnmower. Gradually, my ear retuned. Now, although it's probably a moot point, everyone except telephone solicitors call me Anne, I am, by process of elimination, Ms. Fadiman. I can't be Miss Fadiman because I'm married. I can't be Mrs. Fadiman because my husband is Mr. Colt. I can't be Mrs. Colt because my name is still Fadiman. I am, to my surprise, the very woman for whom Ms. was invented. On the sanguinary fields of gender politics, Ms. has scored a clear victory. I wish I could say the same of, say, the United Church of Christ's new inclusive hymnal, in which Dear Lord and Father of Mankind has been replaced by Dear God embracing humankind. The end is estimable. It's the means that chafe. I'm not sure I want to be embraced by an almighty with so little feeling for poetry. Yet, having heard the new version, I can't say I feel entirely happy with the old one either. As is all too often the case these days, I find my peace as a reader and writer rent by a war between two opposing semantic selves, one feminist and one reactionary. Most people who have written about questions of gender bias in language have belonged to one camp or the other. Either they want to change everything or they don't see what all the fuss is about. Am I the only one who feels torn? Verbally speaking, as in other areas, my feminist self was born of a simple desire for parity. The use of gender-neutral terms like flight attendant, firefighter, and police officer seems to me an unambiguous step forward, part of the same process that has euthanized such terminal patients as authoress and sculptress, good riddance, and is even now working on the gaggingly adorable et words. Usherettes are being promoted to ushers, suffragettes to suffragists. I have been particularly sensitive to words that make women sound little and cute, ever since the day my college roommates and I sat around discussing which animals we all resembled. I'd hoped for something majestic, an eland perhaps, or a great horned owl, but was unanimously declared a gopher. Given that history, it's a wonder no one has ever called me an authorette. My reactionary self, however, prevails when I hear someone attempt to purge the bias from "to each his own" by substituting "to each their own." The disagreement between pronoun and antecedent is more than I can bear. To understand how I feel about grammar, you need to remember that I come from the sort of family in which at the age of 10, I was told I must always say hoi polloi, never the hoi polloi, because hoi meant the, and two thes were redundant, indeed something only hoi polloi would say. Why any 10-year-old would say hoi polloi in the first place is another, more pathological matter, but we won't go into that here. I call the "to each his own" quandary the his-er problem, after a solution originally proposed by Chicago School Superintendent Ella Young in 1912. To each his/her own. I'm sorry, I just can't. My reactionary self has aesthetic as well as grammatical standards, and his/her is hideous. Unlike Ms., his/her could never become reflexive. I might interject here that when I posed the his/her problem to my brother, who was raised in the same grammatical hothouse as I, he surprised me by saying, "I won't say his/her, that would be a capitulation to barbarism, but I would be willing to consider a more rhythmically acceptable neologism such as hyr, higher, or hes, his, which would be preferable to having to avoid his by plotting each sentence in advance like a military campaign," end quote. What about "to each his or her own"? I do resort to that construction occasionally, but I find the double pronoun an ungainly burden. More frequently, I recast the entire sentence in the plural, although "to all their own" is slightly off pitch. Even a phrase that is not stylistically disfigured, for example, "all writers worth their salt," which is only marginally more lumpish than "every writer worth his salt," loses its specificity, that fleeting moment in which the reader conjures up an individual writer, Isaiah Berlin in one's mind eye, Robert James Waller in another, instead of a faceless throng. But I can't go back. I said "to each his own" until about 5 years ago, believing what my 6th grade grammar textbook, Easy English Exercises, had told me, that "or her" was understood, just as womankind was understood to be lurking somewhere within mankind. I no longer understand. The other day I came across the following sentence by my beloved role model, E.B. White. "There is one thing the essayist cannot do. He cannot indulge himself in deceit or concealment, for he will be found out in no time." I felt the door slamming in my face so fast I could feel the wind against my cheek. "But he meant to include you," some of you may be murmuring. "It was understood." I don't think so. Long ago, my father wrote something similar. Clifton Fadiman. "The best essays do not develop original themes. They develop original men, their composers." Since my father, unlike E.B. White, is still around to testify, I called him up last night and said, "Be honest, what was really in your mind when you wrote those sentences?" He replied, "Males. I was thinking about males. I viewed the world of literature, indeed the entire world of artistic creation, as a world of males, and so did most writers. Any writer of 50 years ago who denies that is lying. Any male writer, I mean." I believe that although my father and E.B. White were not misogynists, they didn't really see women, and their language reflected and reinforced that blind spot. Our invisibility was brought home to me 15 years ago after Thunder Out of China, a 1946 bestseller about China's role in the Second World War, was reissued in paperback. Its co-authors were Theodore H. White and Annalee Jacoby, my mother. In his foreword to the new edition, Harrison Salisbury mentioned White 19 times, and my mother once. His first sentence was, "There is, in the end, no substitute for the right man in the right place at the right moment." I wrote to Salisbury, suggesting that sometimes, for example in half of Thunder Out of China, there is no substitute for the right woman in the right place at the right moment. To his credit, he responded with the following mea culpa. Oh, you are totally right. I'm entirely guilty. You're the second person who has pointed that out to me. What can I say? It's just one of those totally dumb things which I do sometimes. I believe that Salisbury was motivated by neither malice nor premeditated sexism. My mother, being a woman, just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong moment. For as long as anyone can remember, my father has called every woman who is more than 10 years his junior a girl. Since he is now 91, that covers a lot of women. He would never call a man over the age of 18 a boy. I've tried to persuade him to mend his ways, but the word is ingrained, and he means it gallantly. He truly believes that inside every stout, white-haired woman of 80, there is the glimmer of that fresh and lissom thing, a girl. If my father was still writing essays, every full-grown girl would probably be transformed by an editor's pencil into a woman. The same thing would happen to E.B. White. In an essay called The Sea and the Wind That Blows, White described a small sailing craft as shaped less like a box than like a fish or a bird or a girl. I don't think he meant a 10-year-old girl. I think he meant a girl old enough to be called a woman. But if he had compared that boat to a woman, his slim little craft, as well as his sentence, would have been forever slowed. What I'm saying here is very simple. Changing our language to make men and women equal has a cost. That doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. High prices are attached to many things that are on the whole worth doing. It does mean that the loss of our heedless grace should be mourned and then accepted with all the civility we can muster by every writer worth his or her salt.